Okay, there we go. All right, so remember that on Friday we're having a test on all the study session stuff, which includes bacteria, viruses, protists, and a little bit of taxonomy. So here's a little bit of that taxonomy. What do we call this diagram? What kind of diagram is it? Phylogenetic tree. And it's supposed to show how things are genetically related to each other and how they're evolutionarily related to each other. So where did protists come from? Some kind of bacteria or archaea-like thing, right? And then what did they lead to? Everything above them, right? Plants supposedly evolved from them. Animals supposedly evolved from them. Fungi supposedly evolved from them.
But isn't the term protist kind of obsolete?
Yeah, and we're getting there. But yes, some protist-like thing, though. All right, protists, as we said in here before, are eukaryotic things. Most of the things that have been called protists over the years are one cells. Most of them are. There are a few multicellular ones, though. Yeah. Protists can be heterotrophic. Some of them can be. Some of them, on the other hand, are autotrophic. So some eat, some make their own food. But pretty much all of them are said to be complex generalists. And that might be a new term for you. What's it mean to be a generalist? One cell has to do everything. Because they don't have what that you have. If they have organelles, they're eukaryotes. They don't have organs, or they don't have, what's the step before an organ? Tissues. And tissues and organs allow our cells to do what? Specialize. Become better at something. Become more efficient. Our cells don't have to be generalists for the most part. Our cells have a certain set of jobs, and that's what they do. Again, remember they're thought to be the first eukaryotic organisms and the descendants of all the eukaryotes that came after, plants, animals, fungi. And we've talked about how they supposedly gave rise to those other things. We talked about these two ideas, endosymbiosis and membrane invagination. How prokaryotes evolved to become eukaryotes. Endosymbiosis is good at explaining what kinds of organelles. What kinds of organelles probably came about by endosymbiosis? Mitochondria, chloroplast, and what other weird one that we sort of talked about?
Golgi.
No, not so much the Golgi. Like the flagella or maybe the cilia. We kind of got taken part of the weekend. But endosymbiosis is not so good at explaining organelles that are basically just what? Just membrane, like bags of stuff, like lysosomes. What did you say?
Ribosomes.
No, not ribosomes. We'll get to ribosomes in a minute. They don't really fit so much in either one of these. Because bacteria, remember, even have ribosomes, so it doesn't really fit. But we're talking about Golgi, we're talking about the ER, we're talking about the lysosomes, both ERs. The peroxisomes, the organelles that are just essentially membranes with some stuff inside. The membrane invagination theory explains that better. And remember, that's the idea that the cell membrane essentially just did what? Pinched in and made a bag. Put some stuff in it. But those two ideas together supposedly explains how bacterial cells became eukaryotic cells. And there we can see a cell. What's the name for the process that's happening there? Phagocytosis. A cell is engulfing a solid particle and then wrapping it with a membrane, putting it in a vessel. Now remember that we have the advantages of being multicellular. Most protists don't. How many cells do you lose every day? Trillions. You lose trillions of cells every day. They die, they're broken down, and is that a big deal? No. So there's sort of safety in numbers. If you're a protist and you lose one cell in a day, what just happened? You died. It's kind of a big deal. But there's definite advantages of being multicellular. The safety in numbers aspect. Also the fact that your cells can specialize. They can divide up the work, can divide up the labor, and become more efficient over time. All right, we've talked several times in here that protista is sort of a term that's falling out of vogue. It's going away. Biologists don't really like to use the word anymore because we said that our classification system is based on what? Phylogenetics. Genetics and evolution and how things have evolved from each other. And as they started looking at the DNA of the things we used to call protists, what have they found? They're not really related. They're different things. So some of the protists have been moved into different kingdoms. A few got moved into fungi, some into plants, and a few don't really belong to a kingdom anymore. They're just in these little groups called non-conforming clades, which essentially means the biologist has said away. We don't know. So they're just over there. We don't know where they go. They don't seem to fit. They're just over here in this group that's just sort of floating out in the middle of nowhere. Maybe we'll figure it out later. Yeah.
So they're not making like
Not right now, because there's not enough. I guess there are arguments there's not enough to do it. And if you made a kingdom for some of them, then you have to make different kingdoms for others that don't fit with those, and you just have kingdoms and kingdoms and kingdoms. So right now, most of them are just kind of floating out there in the middle of nowhere, and they don't really know where they go. Remember, if you do see this word clade, it just means a group, like a taxonomic group, a classification group. Yeah.
Is it like small, or like the ones that don't fit anywhere, is it like small differences from other things, or are they like
They're pretty big genetic differences. That's why they're in different places. All right, I think we also talked a little bit about how protists get their energy. Some protists are heterotrophs. And for a long time, we called those protists, most of those, protozoans. And that word literally means what? First, animal. First animal. They're not really animals, but they're kind of animal-like. They can move, they eat. There's also some heterotrophic protists that are more like fungi, which means they tend to mostly do what? What do fungi usually do? What's their main role? Decay, decomposition. So they feed on dead, decaying kinds of things. So there are some that are either animal-like or fungus-like. And then there are the photoautotrophic ones, which are the ones that can do photosynthesis. And they're more like plants. For a long time, they were mostly called algae. We might also use the term phytoplankton. And that's an important word to know, and we've talked about it before. In here, whenever you see a P and an H and a Y and a T together, sometimes there may be an O at the end, sometimes an E. What does that mean? Fight. In biology, what's fight mean? It means like a plant. Plant-like. And what's plankton mean? Things that float on the water. So there are plant-like things that float on the water. One of the most important parts of the food chains in the oceans, responsible for probably more photosynthesis than anything else in the world. Phytoplankton. All right, there are a few protists that are sort of what we might call the switch hitters of the world. They can be autotrophic, but then again, they can be heterotrophic. Switch back and forth. So they can make their own food, or they can eat if need be. And maybe the most famous example of this is the euglena, which we've talked about several times before. We'll see a picture on the next little slide. But it looks sort of like a plant. It's got chloroplasts, but it also has a flagella, which means it can move. It's got a little red eye spot, which is essentially not about seeing, it's about what? It's a light detector. And basically that euglena is always going to move to the light if it can, because in that context, it can make some energy. It can not make energy, but can make food. Little eye spots right up here. It's this reddish area. All those little green sacs you see in there are chloroplasts. But if it's stuck in a dark area, it begins to eat. It becomes more animal-like. In terms of how they move, most protists are motile, meaning they can move on their own. We just saw the euglena that moved with a flagella. There are lots of protists that have that long whip-like flagella. There are also several that move with shorter hair-like structures, cilia. What's probably the most famous protist with a cilia? The paramecium. We've said several times it sort of looks like what? A hairy shoe. Uses those cilia to move though. And then there are protists that move with pseudopods. Literally, what does that mean? Fake foot, false foot. And by far, what's the most famous one of those? What's the protist that's famous for moving with false feet? Probably the protist you've heard the most about. Amoebas. And we'll see a little video of them moving in a minute. But essentially, they flow. You guys ever seen the horror movie The Blob? It sort of flows. That's the way an amoeba moves. It just sort of like running water almost. Slowly running water. Remember that the flagella and the cilia in eukaryotes, we talked about how they're all basically made the same way. What did we call that arrangement of cilia and flagella? Talk about in classroom. The layout is called a 9+2 array. How that all the eukaryotic cilia and flagella are made of 9 rings or 9 pairs of microtubules on the outside, 2 in the middle. And it's the same throughout all eukaryotes. It's a little bit different than the ones in cilia or in bacteria and other prokaryotes, but remember that some scientists think that the flagella and the cilia might have originally been bacteria that were taken in by a eukaryotic cell and sort of taken in part of the way and used almost like a paddle. All right, in terms of how they reproduce, most of them have a sexual component, a sexual reproductive component. And remember that sexual reproduction is always about what? Genetic variation. That's what it's there for. But a lot of them also reproduce asexually. And we talked over and over again, the advantage of asexual is it's faster, and also it requires less what? Less energy and effort. Doesn't provide any variation. But that's okay as long as the environment is what? Stable. And you as an organism are good at living there. It works. So in terms of where you find them, most protists are aquatic. They live in the water. There are some, though, that live in symbiotic relationships with other organisms. For example, a termite. Termites obviously eat wood, right? What's wood mostly made out of? Cellulose, which is a kind of sugar, a kind of polysaccharide that's notoriously what? Strong and hard to digest. I'm going to tell you that termites on their own cannot digest cellulose. Termites can't digest wood. But what can? The protists that live in their gut. Here's the question. If you're a termite, imagine yourself as a termite. Are you born with these protists that help you to digest your food? No. How do you get them? Your first choice as a baby termite Your first choice in life is literally this. Eat clay. Eat poop or die. Because you get your protists from eating the poop of another termite. And that's essentially your first choice in life. Either eat poop or die. It's a rough life for the termite. But those protists have the enzymes that allow them to digest the wood, the cellulose. Turns out that the termite can't live without the protist, and the protist, that particular protist, can't live without the termite. So that's what kind of symbiotic relationship? That's mutualism. That's a good deal for both. But there's also several protists that have parasitic relationships with other things. One of the infectious diseases that's killed more people than any other is malaria. Where does malaria mostly happen at? In Africa. Tropical places. There used to be some malaria in the United States.
Like in Louisiana.
Why not anymore? We haven't had an outbreak of malaria in probably close to 100 years, maybe more. We killed a whole lot of mosquitoes, mostly using what?
DDT.
DDT, this powerful pesticide.
Isn't that what Carson was talking about?
There's a whole book about DDT called Silent Spring. Because DDT, it was really good at killing mosquitoes, but it also did what? It killed some other things. Birds and fish and maybe people. There are some people today, though, saying that DDT should be re-legalized. It was made illegal, largely because of that book. There's some people today arguing that we need to bring it back. How come? Well, not so much Ebola, no. There's a lot of people still dying of malaria in Africa. And a lot of these people argue that if we use DDT, we could kill those mosquitoes off, and those people would live. We might kill some birds, we might kill some fish, we might cause some cancer, but some people would argue that it's like think of it like a seesaw, that the effects of using it might be better than the effects of not using it, because it's the best pesticide for killing off those kinds of mosquitoes. I'm not arguing that at all. But there is a move to try to re-legalize it. It will never happen. Lots of people who are trying to, eradicate malaria. But I would never make that argument. Dysentery is another famous protist-caused parasitic relationship. What's another name for dysentery? It's really bad diarrhea that you usually would get when what's going on. Yeah, usually you worry about it, dysentery, when there's some kind of like disaster, like the Katrina thing in Louisiana, when the water purification systems are messed up. These things live in fresh water, and that can be a big problem. One that you've heard a lot about on the news lately, that you might catch from like a pond or a lake, is what? It's been on the news a lot the last month or two. Not even more. Yeah. The brain-eating amoeba.
Isn't that so sensationalized?
It is sensationalized, but it's a real deal. That from swimming around in fresh water, you can get this amoeba like through your nostrils and stuff, and it can get up in your brain and essentially start to eat your brain and kill you. Pretty scary stuff. But most protists are not dangerous. Like bacteria, most of them are good. Most of them are important for the environment. There are some mutualistic ones. There are some parasitic ones, though. When the environment gets bad, probably here we mean either too hot or too cold, maybe too dry.
pH.
Yeah, I don't know about the pH with protists. Maybe, but I'm not sure. The protist will make this hard shell, essentially, around their DNA coat, and then they'll die. But when the environment gets better, what happens to that DNA? It grows a new protist. We talked about a very similar thing in bacteria. We call those endospores. Made them really hard to kill. Lets them withstand, like I said, harsh winters, dry summers. Very important for the survival of protists out in nature. In protists, we just call them spores. In bacteria, we call the same kind of thing endospores. It's essentially a protective coat around their DNA. What we're going to look at next is some of the major protist groups. A few years back, taxonomy was a big part of this class. And that's when this PowerPoint was made. Since then, they've taken a lot of the taxonomy stuff out of the class. So there's going to be a lot of like group names and stuff on here that you don't need to know. I will try to point out to you what you need to know and what you don't. Mostly, I want you to get some examples from this part of the present. For example, like this Diplomonodida, you don't need to know that name. I want you to get an example, though, of a protist. Kind of a famous protist is this thing called Giardia lamblia. And this is a protist that causes what's called camper's diarrhea. You might also call it, I think it's the same thing that causes what's called Montezuma's revenge. You go to Mexico, you drink the water, Montezuma's revenge, right? You ever heard of Montezuma's revenge?
Yeah.
You know who Montezuma was, right? Aztec, yeah. Anyway, I'll let you figure that out. How many of you have been hiking like in the Gatlinburg area? There's streams all over the place there, right? They look fresh and cold. And it's very tempting if you're out hiking and you didn't bring a bottle of water with you, just bend down and drink out of those streams. And then it looks fresh and nice. And is that ever a good idea? It's not ever a good idea because there very likely are protists living in that water, even though it looks pure. And those can cause you some extreme diarrhea. Giardia is one of the most famous ones. And notice it says it's caught by drinking feces water. Yeah, pretty much any mammal at least. That water looks pure, but just off the stream, probably what was drinking out of that water? Maybe a bear, maybe a coyote. And while they're around the stream, what do they tend to do? They do their business, which might mean pooping.
Why did they not get sick?
They probably do. And so it doesn't really make sense that they would poop near the water, but they haven't figured that out yet because they don't know what causes diseases. You think they're doing it on purpose?
No, I don't even.
No, they don't. They don't. That's Giardia, kind of a weird looking little creature with a little flagella sticking out everywhere. All right, the next one I want to talk about is this thing called a trypanosome. And this is one I do want you to know about. There's been a lot in the news the last few weeks about Africa with Ebola. There's Ebola for you. But this thing is almost as scary as Ebola. It causes a disorder. Anybody know what disorder this causes? It causes a disease called African sleeping sickness. Which essentially, you go to sleep and you don't wake up. You go into like a coma that you may or may not ever wake up from. How do you get this trypanosome inside you? Yeah, they're these flies, and they're called tsetse flies. Tsetse flies. You might think of them sort of like mosquitoes. They bite people, try to feed on the blood. This trypanosome has co-evolved with that tsetse fly. So they live in the tsetse fly. Do they hurt the fly? They don't hurt the fly. They're just sort of passengers. But when the fly bites you, you get injected with this organism, this protist. And this is a slide up here. What are those little round-looking cells in there? Those are red blood cells. And then this crazy-looking, weird shape, like sickle-shaped thing, that's a trypanosome. And these things will get into your brain, through your bloodstream. Like I said, can cause you to go into a coma that you may or may not ever wake up from. Kind of
So
scary.
you're in a vegetation.
Yes.
What does it do?
I think it's actually feeding on your brain, but don't quote me on that, but I think so. And your blood, for that matter. So scary stuff. We already talked about Euglena a little bit. Euglena is not so scary. There's our Euglena. Remember, it's one of the protists that we said is mixotrophic. Can be heterotrophic, can be autotrophic. Important part of the food chain. Sort of like an animal, sort of like a plant. All right, the next one is another one that I want you to know a little bit about. It's an organism called a dinoflagellate.
Is that
Which-
the name of the group?
That's the name of this specific type of organism.
Oh.
It's got two flagella, dinoflagellates. Anybody know what these things cost? Dinoflagellates. Kind of a cool thing. There's a dinoflagellate. But what they cause are these things called red tides. Anybody know what a red tide is?
It's like in the water.
Yeah. Justin just used an important word. Every now and then in a body of water, algae will grow out of control. They cover up the whole body of water. And what term did you use for that?
Algae bloom.
Yeah, an algal bloom. Why does that happen? Why do algae just grow out of control all of a sudden?
Because there's like not a predator.
Usually it's because of us. What did we do that made those algae grow out of
Not
control?
all the fish. We fish overfish.
Usually we put something in the water that wasn't supposed to be there. For example, what normally limits the amount of plants that can grow on land or the amount of algae that can grow in the water?
The amount of nutrients.
What nutrient?
Nitrogen.
Usually it's either nitrogen or phosphorus. There's not much of those things in water. There's not a whole lot of those things in soil. Why would we put those in the water? Fertilizer runoff, or maybe runoff from like a subdivision in the county. What's going on in a county subdivision that's not going on in a city subdivision?
Correct.
You have septic tanks, which means when you flush your toilet, where does it go? It goes into a big concrete box in your backyard, and that's got holes in it, and it just flows out all in your yard, right? Under the ground. That's what happens. Right? If that happens to be located near a body of water, where does some of that stuff end up?
And the body of water.
In the water. Okay. For example, how many of you canoed down the Flint River? Whenever you canoe near a major subdivision, like Mount Carmel, for instance, what do you notice about the water as you're going through the Mount Carmel area on the canoe? There are plants growing in the water like crazy there. But if you get on down the water a little bit away from Mount Carmel, what do you notice about the plants? They're not there. And one of the reasons is because there's nitrogen coming from those septic tanks into the water. So it can come from farm runoff, it can come from subdivision runoff, but regardless, the red tide essentially makes the water turn red, because these algae are red colored. Yeah.
Another thing I've read about that,
Mhm.
you know, like the big grass carp, they put in like these stuff cleanups. Well, they eat all the stuff off the bottom and they think they're good, but like when they poop and stuff, it makes those algae blooms because they're so huge.
Yeah.
They let everything back in the water a lot more. So that's why like the Mount Carmel Lake gets it on top, and right there around the plant too. There's some carp down there, so that makes it worse.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of those carp in there, in the Flint. Huge ones. Anyway, here's what a red tide looks like. Let me turn out the light so you can see it. So that's somewhere in a tropical type ocean setting. That's a real color. That's not colorized. It can be sort of bloody red. What else is kind of unique about red tides other than the fact that it's kind of cool red looking? These dinoflagellates make the toxin. What happens to fish in this area? They die because they eat this. If you were sitting on the beach when this is happening, this toxin becomes airborne when the protists are crushed by like the waves, and it can cause your eyes to burn like crazy. It can cause your nose to run like crazy. One other thing that eats them though are like oysters and scallops and that kind of thing. They don't hurt the oysters and the scallops. But what happens to the toxin? It multiplies inside that oyster and scallop because they eat a bunch of those, right? And all that toxin stays in their body. It gets stored in their fat. So what was to happen if you ate one of those oysters or scallops,
You get sick.
it can actually kill you. It can cause something called paralytic shellfish poisoning. So one of the Coast Guard's jobs is to watch for these red tides. And so many miles from where they happen, they have to like ban scalloping and taking of clams and stuff like that for a certain amount of days, so that people don't get hurt from them. These do happen in the Gulf occasionally, in the Gulf of Mexico.
How quickly does it occur?
It happens really fast. I can't tell you like hours, but yeah, it shows up very, very fast. It's pretty common. I mean, there are several of them every year, even in the Gulf. Cool stuff. Dinoflagellates and red tides. All right, another organism that's a good example that I want you just to know about is the Plasmodium. This is the protist that causes malaria. Plasmodium is the thing that causes malaria. So this is sort of the life cycle of Plasmodium. It's co-evolved with the mosquito. Co-evolved just means what? They sort of evolved together. Does this Plasmodium, does it have any effect on the mosquito? Nope. But it's evolved to live in what specific part of that mosquito? It lives in its salivary gland. Why would that make a lot of sense if you're a Plasmodium? When a mosquito bites a mammal, first thing it does is spits on them. Mosquito spit is actually pretty cool stuff. What's in it? Well, yeah, that's not cool. That part's not cool. But what cool things are in there? Yeah, there's a what was called an anticoagulant in there. It keeps your blood from clotting. And there's also like a pain medicine in there to keep you from feeling the bite in the first place. So they numb your skin, and then they keep your blood from clotting so they can suck it up. Well, if you're a little Plasmodium living in a mosquito, it makes sense for you to live in the salivary glands, because as soon as they bite, what just happened to you? You just got transferred from the mosquito to a mammal. And once they get in mammals, notice what they do. They go in the liver, where they reproduce like crazy. They come out of the liver, and they essentially start feeding on your red blood cells. Notice they're just bursting open. What are you going to feel like when that's going on? What do we call it when you don't have enough red blood cells? Anemia. How are you going to feel if you're anemic? You're going to feel really weak because you don't have enough red blood cells, therefore you can't transport enough oxygen, therefore you can't do enough cell respiration, therefore you don't have enough ATP, right? So you feel weak, you don't have enough energy. And eventually it can lead to high fevers, it can lead to death ultimately. Very hard to treat and transferred very quickly from mosquitoes. That's malaria. Here's the paramecium. See how I get the hairy shoe thing, hopefully. Said a lot about a paramecium. It's free living, doesn't cause disease or anything. But one thing I will mention about the paramecium, it usually reproduces asexually. But occasionally, two paramecium will hook together. What do we call that when two bacterial cells hook together? Conjugation. Same thing here. What did the bacteria do once they hooked together? They swapped what little pieces of DNA? They're called plasmids. They're little extra circles that bacteria have. Paramecia don't have those plasmids, but notice they have two nuclei. They have a macro and a micro nucleus. Which one do you think they might swap? The micro one. And that's another source of what? Why would they do that? Diversity, genetic variation. It's like sex, essentially. Probably going to be the last example for today. Potato blight. This is a protist that's a lot like a fungus. And it's really historically important. because it affected what country very badly? Ireland. And how many of you are of Irish descent in this room? You are probably here because of this. Because the Irish, and I'm not sure it was a bad idea to begin with, their whole winter food source was essentially what? Potatoes. And they were growing essentially one kind of potato. Is that ever a good idea? To put all your hopes on one crop, one species of that one crop? Not a good idea. But that's essentially what they were doing. And along comes this protist that infects the potatoes and it causes them to ruin very fast. So essentially they all start starving to death. And a lot of them did starve to death. And a lot of the people who didn't starve ended up just leaving Ireland and coming to places like the United States. I don't know that I have a specific picture of the protist, but there's a potato that's been infected by it. You can see how brown and yucky that looks on the middle. And that potato, that's probably how it came out of the ground. So they all were essentially spoiled. Oh. It probably tastes really nasty. I don't know if it'd make you sick, but it would be nasty. One other quick thing, I forgot about this one that I need to talk about, is a thing called the diatom. It looks like diatom. These things are one of the main components of phytoplankton. So they're floating on the oceans. They are probably the biggest source of photosynthesis in the world. They make more oxygen than most of the plants on Earth. And in the food chain, they are where on the food chain? In the oceans. They're at the bottom. They're the base of lots of food chains in the ocean. So they are hugely, hugely important. One thing really cool about them is they make this shell out of a material called silica. Essentially, what's silica? Keep going. It's essentially glass. You ever noticed in sand the little glass-like particles in the sand?
Yeah.
This is it. The shells of these things. I'll show you a picture of what they look like in a second. But something else you might have noticed. Most toothpastes have that gritty stuff in there, right? The gritty stuff in toothpaste are the shells of these things. And it's essentially like sandpaper for your teeth. So they're also used in soils and stuff like that. But what you need to know about diatoms is that they're probably the base of most ocean food chains. And they've got these shells made of silica. Here's what they look like. They're kind of cool looking. Oops. Wrong button. Well. There's a lot of different kinds of diatoms. They all have that glassy-like shell. One other thing that I will mention are these guys. What do we call what we're looking at here? It's called kelp. Kelp. Sometimes it's called brown algae. But these things essentially make like forests under the water. What do you see back in the middle of the slide there? I think those are seals, maybe sea lions. Seals and sea lions, this normally is going to grow where? Where are seals and sea lions normally found? Cold water. Like the northern part of the U.S. in particular, certain parts of South Africa. Why do the seals and sea lions like to hide out in this? From what? From sharks, mostly. Apparently sharks are afraid to come into these kelp beds. Don't know why. Not much in it that's going to get them, right? But they avoid it. So the seals get in here, they're pretty safe. But these are also an important part of the food chain. Kelp is eaten by people in certain parts of the world, like Japan. A lot of Asian people eat this is what you might call seaweed, right? It's Was at one time characterized as a protist, yes. Now I think it's characterized as a plant, but was a protist at one point in time. And the very last thing that I want to show you, this is an amoeba. And let's get this video going. I'll let you watch it flow, and we'll call it a day. So now you can see how the amoeba is flowing, and these little extensions of its cytoplasm are what? Pseudopods, and this is sort of flowing toward those pseudopods. What are the little green-like chunks inside it? Not chloroplasts, because these things don't have chloroplasts. My guess is it may be chloroplast, but it's probably chloroplast from something that it what? That it ate. It just hasn't completely digested just yet. All right, that's a good place to stop. That's this part of the test.